And so these musicians, to me, showed me another view of my culture that I could latch on to and say, okay, they're expressing sentiments that are a lot more complex than segregation now, segregation forever, you know?
Sure.
And I think it was really central for us as kids getting through that period. We didn't have tolerance classes, you know, just suddenly one day, we went from a segregated school to an integrated school.
You tell about that beautifully.
And we don't know what to do. And our parents don't have the tools to talk to us about. You know, my parents were, as you say, more progressive than my extended family, but they didn't have the tools to really sit down and say, look, this is a new era.
Had not had the experience.
They hadn't had the experience. Nobody had the experience except for us.
That's
you
right.
know,
yeah.
And music was just such a curative and healing part of that transition.
You know, there's a beautiful comment in the book. You're interviewing Charlie Daniels about race. And he talks about his own self-examination, his own inability to, at the outset, look upon Dr. King and the civil rights demonstrators as anything but people who are out of place, and how, as he listened and as he thought about it, he came to a deeper understanding of it. And it's almost symbolic of what so many other Southerners ultimately had to face.
Exactly. I think his story is really pivotal. Here's a man, for one thing, who's I couldn't disagree with more politically.
Politically, right.
But here's a man about my father's age, who, you know, a little younger, but not a whole lot younger. He was an older rock musician at that time, who sat down with me and said, basically, I was an avowed racist. This is how I grew up. I believed blacks were inferior to whites. That's the way we were programmed to believe in Wilmington, North Carolina during that period. And again, music, you know, he listened to music. He listened to black gospel, and still didn't, you know, his mind wasn't changed by the music, but the music led him to situations with other musicians, some of whom were black, that gave him another view of the culture. And then, of course, Martin Luther King Jr. came onto the scene. Television came onto the scene, and he watched this man give that speech, and suddenly Charlie Daniels goes, whoa, everything I believed was wrong.
It's interesting to me how Charlie Daniels, you know, many people think of King, and immediately what comes to mind is I Had a Dream.
Right.
That great speech in front of the Lincoln. Daniels thinks about the speech the night before he died,
Been to the
when he
mountaintop.
almost has a premonition of death. I mean, I've been to the mountaintop. And I thought it was fascinating that in thinking about King, he thinks not about what we all think about when we see his image on the screen, but of that night in that church where he was, as I say, if you read the words, it's almost as if he
knew.
He was fatal. Yeah, he was fatalistic.
And that's why Charlie Daniels quotes that speech, is because, for one thing, that showed how much faith and conviction this one man had. You know, and Daniels even says in there, he says he could have gone back to, you know, at any point. Could have
gone back to his church.
Could have gone back to the church and said, you know, you guys can take over from here, but he didn't. He kept going, and he kept going until he got to the point where he knew something was going to happen, and he still kept going. And that, to quote Charlie Daniels, is faith. That's just the pure essence of faith.
Talk about that period of your life when your intersection with music and your life in the South, I guess, sort of makes you want to put it behind you and go somewhere else.
Right. you know, I talk about phases in this book, phases of music and phases of our culture. I originally wrote this as an essay for the New York Times, where I talked about how Southern rock music from civil rights until now has gone through phases. First, you got the melancholy and sadness and shame that was expressed in the Allman Brothers music. And then Leonard Skinner kind of expressed, and Charlie Daniels to a certain extent, the anger of being branded as a wholesale racist by people outside of the South and musicians outside of the South, songwriters and writers outside of the South. They expressed the anger, you know. And then another period of music came around that's typified by REM from Athens, Georgia.
Yep.
They expressed more of kind of an intellectual and artistic distancing from the pain and the anger. If you listen to their music, it's fairly abstract. You know, you get Southern characters with names like Wendell G. and Old
Right.
Man Kinsey.
Right,
And
right.
you get scenes, but you're kind of distanced from the emotion. It was at that point that I remember that's the early '80s.
Yeah.
And I was a newspaper reporter in Burlington, North Carolina, and the racism was still. I felt like I was constantly dealing with racism, and the sheriff's department,
Sure.
the emergency services. I was tired of it, and I said, I want to write about music. I want to move on, and I moved to New York, and I did that. I started writing about music. I achieved some of my dreams working for Rolling Stone magazine, ultimately MTV. But I still could not shake this sense of being Southern, and this duality of what another musician calls the duality of the Southern thing. Pride in being a Southerner, and shame and anger of being over our history. So these things were constantly coming into my mind, and during that period came another phase of Southern music that kind of expressed more of an acceptance of who we are as a culture. And that's what I discussed. That's kind of the narrative line of the book, and was kind of the narrative of my essay.
For those of you just tuning in, we're talking with Mark Kemp about his new book, and it's a great book. It's Dixie Lullaby, and it's a story of race and music and new beginnings in the New South, as you say. Let me read you something you wrote that I think sort of captures the emotional dilemma many Southerners experience when they're trying. They don't say it as well as you say it here. By the time Leonard Skinner's plane went down in 1977, I'd already left the South in my mind. Things had become too sticky, too complicated. I couldn't reconcile what I felt were intolerable contradictions. Hikers, hunters, football, rock and roll, rednecks, hippies, fundamentalist Christians, philosophy professors, Jesse Helms, Jimmy Carter. Sometimes I wonder if I ever was actually a true Southerner.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know how many young people, even today, still feel caught in that trap of inconsistencies.
In that quagmire, yeah, that.
And it's an emotional trap, really.
It is. That one must be freed of. You have to be freed of that emotional trap before I think you can be happy, or I don't know exactly what it is that I'm talking about, what you'll be, but before you can be freed of that, you have to look at it and kind of accept the contradictions. And in life, you don't have to be Southern to come to that point. It's almost like a moment of clarity. But I do remember very well just going, I don't feel right here. I've got to leave, and I had left in my mind.
And then there came a time